In the heart of Central Asia, travelers once encountered towers that were not built of stone or brick, but of human skulls stacked with deliberate precision. These were not symbols nor legends, but warnings. Entire cities vanished after defying a single man. Survivors described rivers clogged with bodies and streets layered with bones. His armies did not merely conquer, they erased. This is the true story of Tamerlane, the ruler who turned mass death into architecture and terror into strategy. The man history remembers as Tamerlane was born Timur ibn Taragai in 1336 in the region of Transoxiana near modern-day Samarkand. He did not inherit a throne, a kingdom, or even legitimacy. He was born into a fractured world of collapsing Mongol authority, rival clans, and endless warfare. From the beginning, Timur learned that survival depended not on mercy, but on fear. Unlike Genghis Khan, whose lineage granted him divine authority in the steppe, Timur lacked noble descent. This absence shaped his entire philosophy of power. He understood that to rule without legitimacy, he needed reputation, and reputation in a violent age was built through excess. Timur did not simply defeat enemies, he annihilated them publicly, theatrically, and irreversibly. By his early 30s, Timur had already forged a formidable cavalry army drawn from Turkic and Mongol warriors hardened by decades of war. These men were loyal not to an empire, but to victory and spoils. Timur rewarded obedience generously and punished resistance absolutely. Cities that opened their gates were spared. Cities that resisted were destroyed so completely that their names faded from maps. His first campaigns across Persia revealed his method. After capturing cities such as Isfahan, initial surrender was followed by rebellion. Timur's response was calculated terror. Chroniclers describe how tens of thousands were executed in a single day. Their skulls were collected, cleaned, and stacked into massive towers at the city gates. These structures were not random brutality. They were messages written in bone. The skull towers served a dual purpose. To Timur's enemies, they promised annihilation. To his own army, they reinforced discipline. Disobedience carried consequences as final as those inflicted on the conquered. Fear flowed downward as effectively as loyalty flowed upward. Word spread faster than armies. Merchants whispered of cities erased overnight. Refugees carried stories of children slaughtered, scholars executed, artisans enslaved. Many towns surrendered before Timur ever appeared on the horizon. In this way, terror became his most effective weapon. The skull towers marched ahead of him. Timur saw himself not as a butcher, but as an instrument of divine order. He claimed that chaos justified extermination, that resistance was rebellion against fate. In his court, poets praised destruction as purification. Victory was proof of righteousness. Death was merely arithmetic. By the time Timur declared Samarkand his capital, he had already laid the foundations of an empire built on ash. The city glittered with wealth looted from burned lands. Architects were spared from massacres and forced to build monuments celebrating a ruler whose legacy would be measured not in borders, but in bodies.
This was only the beginning.
By the late 1380s, Timur's power was no longer confined to the steppe. His armies poured south and west, carving a path through Persia, Mesopotamia, and the Caucasus. Each campaign followed the same grim pattern: swift cavalry assaults, siege warfare perfected through experience, and psychological terror deployed with ruthless precision. Timur understood that walls could be broken faster when fear entered a city before his soldiers did. In Persia, cities like Shiraz and Tabriz witnessed both mercy and horror. When local rulers submitted without resistance, Timur spared populations and confirmed elites in their positions. But even a rumor of defiance was enough to seal a city's fate. Chroniclers recount how after one uprising, Timur ordered the execution of so many inhabitants that the ground itself darkened with blood. The skull towers rose again, carefully assembled by surviving captives under guard, each skull facing outward as if staring at the living. Timur's violence was not impulsive, it was systematic. He kept detailed records of punishments, assigning quotas of death to his commanders. Soldiers were required to present heads as proof of obedience. Failure to meet expectations invited suspicion. Excess was rewarded. In this way, mass killing became bureaucratic, an extension of command rather than chaos. As Timur advanced into Mesopotamia, Baghdad stood as a symbol of former glory. Once the center of learning and culture, the city had already declined, but its name still carried weight. When it resisted Timur's authority, he responded with one of the most infamous massacres of his career. Contemporary accounts describe over 90,000 people killed in a matter of days. Streets were choked with corpses. Survivors were forced to build towers of skulls so numerous that observers claimed they blotted out the skyline. These acts shocked even an age accustomed to cruelty, yet Timur believed they were necessary. His empire stretched across diverse cultures, languages, and religions. Fear, he reasoned, was the only universal language. Where laws failed, terror succeeded. Where loyalty wavered, annihilation enforced obedience. Despite his brutality, Timur was not a mindless destroyer. He selectively spared craftsmen, scholars, and engineers. These captives were deported to Samarkand, transforming the city into a center of art and architecture. Mosques, madrasas, and palaces rose, built by hands taken from cities Timur had destroyed. Beauty and horror became inseparable in his reign. Religion further justified his campaigns. Though a Muslim, Timur did not hesitate to slaughter fellow Muslims if they opposed him. He framed his wars as divinely sanctioned struggles against disorder. Imams in his court praised victories as signs of God's favor. Dissenters did not argue theology for long. They joined the dead. The skull towers multiplied across the landscape like milestones marking his expansion. Each one reinforced the legend that resistance was futile. Cities sent envoys bearing keys and tribute, begging for mercy before Timur ever arrived. Many survived because of fear instilled by those who had not. By the early 1390s, Timur's name alone emptied roads and silenced markets. His empire had no clear borders, only zones of terror radiating outward. Wherever his banners appeared, people understood the choice before them: submission or extinction. And still his ambition grew. The skull towers were no longer warnings, they were signatures, announcing that Timur had passed through, leaving a landscape permanently altered by death. As Timur's dominion expanded, his wars grew larger in scale and ambition. The skull towers were no longer improvised instruments of terror. They became ritualized monuments of conquest. Chroniclers describe how Timur sometimes ordered separate towers for men, women, and children, arranged with chilling symmetry. These structures were positioned at city gates or crossroads, ensuring that travelers would carry the warning far beyond the ruins themselves. In the Caucasus and Anatolia, resistance stiffened. Local rulers believed distance and terrain might protect them. Mountains, fortified passes, and ancient walls offered hope. Timur answered with patience and methodical cruelty. He cut supply lines, poisoned wells, and waited. When starvation weakened defenders, his armies surged forward. The aftermath followed a familiar script. Executions counted by the tens of thousands, skulls cleaned and stacked, cities erased from maps. One of the most infamous campaigns unfolded in northern India. In 1398, Timur crossed the Indus River, leading an army hardened by decades of slaughter. Delhi, wealthy and crowded, became his target. Though its rulers attempted resistance, the city fell quickly. What followed shocked even Timur's own officers. Over a single day, prisoners captured outside the city were systematically executed. Tens of thousands killed before the main assault even began. Timur later wrote that this was necessary to prevent revolt. The skull towers rose again, this time under a burning Indian sun. Delhi was sacked mercilessly. Homes were looted, mosques desecrated, and entire neighborhoods destroyed. Fires raged unchecked. Survivors described rivers clogged with bodies and streets layered with the dead. When Timur finally departed, the city was left shattered, its population decimated, its wealth stripped away. The skull towers remained, silent witnesses to devastation on a scale few had imagined possible. Yet even as destruction followed him, Timur cultivated an image of order. He punished his own soldiers for unauthorized looting and executed commanders who disobeyed strategic commands. To him, violence was acceptable only when it served authority. Random cruelty was weakness. Controlled terror was power. This distinction allowed him to view himself not as a monster, but as a ruler imposing discipline upon chaos. Timur's court in Samarkand reflected this contradiction. Scholars debated philosophy under domed ceilings, while artisans crafted intricate tile work. Ambassadors from distant lands arrived bearing gifts, speaking in hushed tones about the skull towers they had passed on the road. The city became a paradox, a beacon of culture built on the bones of the conquered. Foreign observers struggled to understand him. Some described Timur as a barbarian, others as a strategic genius. European envoys noted his sharp intellect and meticulous planning. They were also careful never to offend him. One misplaced word could transform diplomacy into massacre. As Timur aged, the violence did not diminish. Instead, it intensified. Campaigns against the Ottomans and rival Turkic powers added new regions to the map of terror. After the Battle of Ankara in 1402, defeated soldiers and civilians alike were executed in massive numbers. Once again, skull towers marked the landscape, rising near ruined fortresses as declarations of absolute dominance. These towers served another purpose. They erased memory.
Cities reduced to bones lost their histories, their records burned, their people scattered or dead. Timur's conquests reshaped entire civilizations, leaving gaps where cultures once thrived. Fear ensured obedience, but it also ensured silence. Few dared record full accounts of what they witnessed. By now, the skull towers had become legend. Mothers frightened children into obedience by whispering Timur's name. Merchants planned routes to avoid lands he might cross. Rulers surrendered preemptively, hoping mercy might follow submission. Sometimes it did. Often it did not. Timur seemed unconcerned with legacy as others understood it. He did not seek love or admiration. He sought permanence through dominance. Stone crumbles, cities fall, but fear, once planted, can outlive generations. The towers of skulls were his monuments, grim, unforgettable, and impossible to ignore. And yet, even Timur could not escape time. His body aged, his health weakened, but his ambitions remained vast. He planned new wars, new conquests, and, inevitably, new towers. The world he shaped was one where survival depended on obedience, and memory itself bowed before terror.
By the early years of the 15th century, Timur's empire stretched from the steppes of Central Asia to the edges of the Mediterranean world. It was an empire forged not through administration or law, but through repeated demonstrations of annihilation. Wherever his banners appeared, communities faced an impossible choice: submit instantly or be erased completely. The skull towers were the proof that hesitation meant extinction. Timur understood psychology as deeply as he understood warfare. He often spared cities that surrendered without resistance, allowing their populations to survive under heavy tribute. These spared cities became living messengers. Traders, pilgrims, and envoys carried stories of what happened to those who resisted. Fear traveled faster than armies. Entire regions collapsed without a single battle because the alternative was too horrifying to contemplate. Yet submission did not always guarantee safety. Timur demanded absolute obedience, and even minor acts of defiance could trigger catastrophe. In Persia and Mesopotamia, cities that paid tribute but later rebelled were punished more severely than those that had resisted openly. Timur viewed betrayal as the greatest crime. In such cases, he ordered executions that exceeded all previous massacres. Chroniclers describe skull towers so large they required weeks to construct, their pale surfaces visible from miles away. The labor itself was part of the terror. Survivors were often forced to clean skulls, stack them, and mortar them into place using mud and lime. This ensured that the memory of defeat was burned into the minds of those left alive. These people carried trauma back to their villages, spreading fear more effectively than any proclamation. Despite the brutality, Timur never ruled as a mindless destroyer. He carefully selected which cities to obliterate and which to preserve. Centers of trade, scholarship, and craftsmanship were often relocated rather than destroyed. Skilled artisans, architects, and scholars were forcibly transported to Samarkand. There, they contributed to the construction of grand mosques, palaces, and madrasas. The city flourished, even as the countryside around it lay in ruins. This selective preservation revealed Timur's ultimate vision. He did not want a world reduced entirely to ash. He wanted a world reordered around himself. Destruction was the tool, centralization was the goal.
Samarkand stood as the symbolic heart of his empire, a glittering capital sustained by the wealth and labor extracted from devastated lands. Religious leaders struggled to respond. Some praised Timur as a defender of faith, citing his patronage of Islamic institutions. Others condemned him as a tyrant whose cruelty violated divine law. Timur listened to both, but followed neither completely. Faith, like fear, was something to be controlled, not obeyed. As news of his conquests spread westward, Europe watched with anxiety. Envoys sent to Timur's court reported contradictory impressions, a ruler capable of philosophical discussion, poetry, and generosity, yet utterly unmoved by mass death. This contradiction made him even more terrifying. He was not driven by rage or impulse. He killed deliberately, calmly, and without regret. Toward the end of his life, Timur turned his attention to what he considered unfinished business. China loomed in his imagination as the final great prize. Preparations began for a massive eastern campaign. Troops were gathered, supplies stockpiled, and routes planned. The skull towers, though fewer now, still marked the edges of his empire, reminders of what expansion required. In 1405, before the campaign could begin, Timur fell ill. Even then, he continued issuing orders from his bed, planning movements and punishments. Death came quietly, without spectacle. There were no towers built for his passing, no cities destroyed in his name that day. After his death, the empire he created began to fracture. Successors lacked his authority and his terrifying reputation. Regions rebelled. Cities once subdued by fear dared to resist again. Over time, the skull towers collapsed, weathered by rain and forgotten by survivors who wanted to forget. Yet memory did not vanish entirely. Stories endured. Ruins whispered of cities that had once existed. Travelers still found fields littered with bones generations later. Historians struggled to calculate the true human cost of Timur's campaigns, but estimates reached into the millions. Timur left no code of laws, no unified administration, no lasting institutions. What he left was a lesson written in bone. Power enforced through terror can conquer the world, but it cannot hold it forever. His towers of skulls achieved their purpose in life, but in death they became symbols of a reign remembered not for what it built, but for what it destroyed.
In the decades after Timur's death, the lands he had crushed struggled to understand what had happened to them. Entire generations had grown up knowing only war, flight, and submission. Villages that once thrived along trade routes were gone, replaced by empty plains where nothing moved except the wind. The towers of skulls, though slowly crumbling, still haunted the landscape like warnings carved into the earth itself. Chroniclers of the Timurid court attempted to shape Timur's legacy into something noble. They emphasized his victories, his patronage of architecture, his devotion to learning. In their writings, the skull towers became unfortunate necessities, acts of discipline required to bring order to a chaotic world. But outside the court, in the memories of survivors, the story was very different. To them, Timur was not a lawgiver or a unifier. He was the storm that erased everything familiar. Archaeological evidence confirms what written sources only hint at. Mass graves discovered across Central Asia, Persia, and northern India reveal layers of violent death clustered around the dates of Timur's campaigns. Many skeletons show signs of execution rather than battle wounds. These were not soldiers fallen in combat. They were civilians, craftsmen, merchants, farmers, and children. The towers of skulls were not exaggerations or metaphors. They were real structures built from real people. Timur's methods influenced future conquerors. His reputation became a weapon that long outlived him. Later rulers invoked his name to intimidate enemies, even when they lacked his military strength. The idea that terror itself could be systematized, planned, and deployed strategically was one of his most enduring contributions to the history of warfare. Yet fear proved fragile over time. Without Timur's personal authority, the machinery of terror lost its efficiency. His successors attempted to rule through administration rather than annihilation, but the damage had already been done. Economic networks had been shattered. Agricultural systems had collapsed. Trust between rulers and populations was non-existent. In many regions, recovery took centuries. Samarkand remained magnificent, its blue-tiled domes and towering minarets dazzling travelers. But even there, prosperity rested on unstable foundations. The city was a monument built atop the suffering of countless others. Its beauty could not erase the memory of how it had been financed. Foreign observers continued to debate Timur's place in history. Some compared him to Alexander the Great, arguing that both men reshaped the world through conquest. Others rejected the comparison entirely. Alexander founded cities that endured. Timur left ruins that whispered warnings. Where Alexander spread culture, Timur spread silence. Legends exaggerated the skull towers until they became almost mythical. Some tales claimed towers made of hundreds of thousands of heads rising like mountains. While such numbers are impossible to verify, the exaggeration itself reveals how deeply the terror penetrated collective memory. When fear becomes legend, it means it was once real enough to be unforgettable. Religious scholars attempted to explain Timur's rise as divine punishment for moral decay. Others insisted he was a test of faith, a reminder of humanity's capacity for evil. These interpretations offered meaning, but not comfort. Meaning could not restore the dead. The most unsettling aspect of Timur's story is not his cruelty alone, but how methodical it was. He did not lose control. He did not act in moments of blind rage. Each massacre followed calculation. Each tower was placed deliberately. Terror was not a side effect of his rule. It was the rule. As centuries passed, nature reclaimed the sites of his atrocities. Bones turned to dust. Towers collapsed into unremarkable mounds. Grass grew where blood had soaked the soil. Yet the absence of physical evidence did not erase the historical truth. Written records, oral traditions, and archaeological traces converged on the same conclusion. Timur's empire was built as much from fear as from force. By the time modern historians attempted to measure his impact, the numbers no longer mattered as much as the pattern. Repeated destruction on such scale left scars that shaped migration, politics, and cultural memory across Eurasia. The world Timur conquered was not simply defeated, it was permanently altered. Block 5 closes on this realization. The Towers of Skulls were never meant to last forever. Their purpose was immediate, psychological, and absolute.
They succeeded in their time. But history would remember Timur not as the builder of an empire, but as the architect of terror, whose greatest monuments were made from human remains.
In the modern world, Timur, known in the West as Tamerlane, exists uneasily between myth and history. Statues rise in his honor in parts of Central Asia, presenting him as a national founder and military genius. School books praise his strategic brilliance. Tourist guides point to restored monuments in Samarkand as symbols of cultural rebirth. Yet beneath this polished narrative lies a darker truth that cannot be erased by marble or bronze. The skull towers remain the most disturbing symbol of his reign because they strip away every excuse. They were not accidents of war. They were not misunderstandings between cultures. They were deliberate structures designed to turn human life into architecture. Each tower was a message written in bone. Resistance would be answered with annihilation. Modern historians now reject older romanticized portrayals of Timur. Careful comparison of Persian chronicles, European travel accounts, Indian records, and archaeological data reveals consistent patterns. Cities that resisted were erased. Cities that surrendered early sometimes survived, but only temporarily. Loyalty was never permanent. Fear had to be renewed through spectacle, and spectacle required victims. Psychologists studying collective trauma have pointed to Timur's campaigns as early examples of terror warfare at a continental scale. His actions demonstrate how fear can override rational decision-making, forcing populations into submission even when resistance might have been possible. In this sense, the skull towers were as powerful as any army. They fought battles before soldiers ever arrived. Yet terror alone could not build a lasting state. Timur's empire fractured almost immediately after his death. His heirs lacked his authority and his appetite for destruction. Without continuous violence, the empire unraveled. Regions that had been held together by fear quickly sought independence. The skull towers, once symbols of absolute power, became relics of a system that could not survive without constant bloodshed. The contrast is striking. Timur wanted to be remembered as a world conqueror, a ruler chosen by destiny. Instead, history remembers him as a warning. His legacy demonstrates the limits of violence as a foundation for civilization. You can conquer cities with terror. You cannot govern the future with it. In recent decades, forensic archaeology has given voice to those Timur tried to silence. Excavations uncover mass graves where no monuments were ever meant to stand. These remains tell stories more honest than any court chronicle. They reveal age, diet, injury, and cause of death. They show that the victims were not just warriors, but entire communities erased in moments of calculated cruelty. The skull towers themselves are mostly gone, but their absence is meaningful. They were designed to shock the living, not to endure. Their disappearance mirrors the fate of Timur's empire. Both achieved immediate dominance, neither achieved permanence. Today, When historians ask how many skulls filled those towers, the question misses the deeper point. Whether tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands, the intention was the same. The scale was meant to overwhelm comprehension. Timur understood that numbers beyond counting become symbols, and symbols reshape reality. His story forces an uncomfortable reflection on power. It challenges the idea that greatness can be separated from cruelty. It asks whether conquest without restraint deserves admiration at all. Timur achieved everything a conqueror could want: fear, obedience, glory, and lost everything a ruler needs: stability, loyalty, continuity. As the final echoes of his campaigns fade into history, one truth remains unavoidable. The towers of human skulls were not only monuments to death, they were monuments to a choice to rule through terror, a choice to turn human beings into warnings, a choice whose consequences still haunt the pages of history. This is why Tamerlane's name endures, not because of the empire he built, but because of the unimaginable cost at which it was built. His greatest structures were not palaces or mosques, they were towers of silence, built from the remains of those who stood in his path, reminding the world that absolute power leaves nothing standing, not even itself.